One of the key aspects of a realistic scale model is a nicely applied camouflage pattern. Smooth lines, tightly sprayed edges, and realistically sized spray pattern, these are the tricks to make your model look like a true miniature of the real thing. Today I'm going to show you the tools, techniques, and products I use to achieve a nice 3-color camouflage on this Challenger 2. So now let's get started. Alright, now before we even start shooting any paint, make sure there's no dust on your model. This is the first step to making sure your paint is smooth and doesn't look really crappy. It is never required, but always a good idea to prime your model. I like to use either Mr. Surfacer or the Tamiya Fine Surface Primer spray cans to prepare my model's surface. However, today I'm actually going to try a new product, which is the VMS No Peel Surface Primer. Priming is a good idea. Like I said, it gives you a unified surface finish. In this case, the model has numerous different types of plastic and some 3D printed parts, and if you have photo etch, resin, priming is really a good idea. Also, in this case, I'm also black basing the model, so I can leave this black primer showing in any crevices or places where I want there to be more shadow later on. It's kind of like a good insurance policy. I'm shooting the VMS primer just straight out of the bottle at about 20 psi or so, and it goes on perfectly fine. Let's talk about the paints. So here's the type of paints I like to use on my models. Mr. Color and Tamiya are both alcohol-based acrylic paints. And the AK Real Colors here are lacquers, but they behave very similarly to Tamiya paints. Now all 4 of these paints here, they're very durable and they spray very well, much better than these water-based acrylics, which you can use, but I don't like them very much. These paints are much more forgiving, easier to work with, and you can also thin them with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner for a smooth and durable finish. If you really want to use water-based paints, I would recommend the new Atom paints by Megamo. They're water-based, but they behave and are as durable as these paints here. So it's a great middle ground, and you can even just use the non-toxic Megamo 2000 thinner. However, today I'm going to stick with my tried and true Tamiya paints. Here's what we're going to be using. XF92 will be our base paint, and then for the fine squiggles and stripes, we're going to use these 2 paints here. And of course, Mr. Color Leveling Thinner will be used to thin the paints for a durable and smooth application. It's always a good idea to first do a test spray on the bottom of your model or a test paint mule to make sure your paint is spraying nicely. In this case, my first mix was too thick, and it would have given me a pebbly orange peeled finish if I'd sprayed it on the rest of the model. So I thinned it down a little bit more and committed to actually spraying the base color of the camouflage. Note here that I'm not hosing this on and getting solid application in one pass. That's going to give you not a really good surface finish. You might have pooling, you might fill in the details, and it's not going to look very good. Instead, you want to build up the color in like 2 or 3 thin passes, even more if possible. This is just a tank, so it doesn't need to be perfect, but if you're like doing airplanes or cars, the more thin layers the better. You're going to get a nice smooth finish, which looks much more realistic. Alright, now let's talk about airbrushes. So here are 2 really cheap Chinese knockoff airbrushes of Iwata's basically, and these work perfectly fine. I used one of these to prime the model and for the base paint. This Neo Eco one I would recommend if you want to get a super cheap Chinese airbrush, because this one is the most durable and sprays the best of all the ones I have. However, for detail work, I recommend investing in a proper detail airbrush. Here are 2 that I have in my collection. The Badger Renegade Chrome, I got it for like $100 at the yearly Badger birthday sale. This is a great airbrush. However, today we're actually going to try this new H&S Infinity I was gifted. Thank you very much, Bill. When it comes to shooting the actual precise camouflage pattern, you really want to go more thin than you think with the paint. As you can see here, I'm like 90% thinner, and then I'm just taking my paintbrush and like just covering the handle with paint and dipping that in. This is a very thin mix, and that is the key to getting a fine spray pattern, tight edges, and a realistic effect. When I'm starting to paint the actual shapes of the camouflage, Notice how I am not just painting them in one go. First I'm outlining the shape, and then I'm kind of filling it in with little squiggles. This is part of the scale look of the camouflage pattern. Imagine you are a 1/35th scale or smaller man and you have a little tiny spray gun. You can't do that huge wide stripe in one go. And that is why a prototypical camouflage pattern will rarely have consistent width to the stripes. Spraying the paint this way makes it look like it was truly painted by a little man, and that's what makes your model look like a model and not like something that was airbrushed by a 1-to-1 scale person. Now, of course, this always depends on the camouflage pattern you're going for, but in general, this is a good practice to follow. So here's an example of how not to paint the camouflage pattern. I'm doing what I told you not to do. I'm painting it in one solid pass. And you can see it just kind of looks like someone sprayed it with an airbrush, right? The sprayed edges aren't tight, and the consistent width of the camouflage stripe doesn't look realistic. Another thing I want to point out here is that you'll notice that I'm going back and forth between the two colors. I didn't paint all the green and then paint all the black. I paint some of the green, and I switch to the black, paint some of the black, and then I go back to the green, and I'll go back and forth. And this takes a while, but we're in this hobby not to finish a model as quickly as possible. We're here to have a fun, meditative process as we go through and make a real miniature, right? In doing it that way, I find I have a better time kind of planning the camouflage out because I'm not locked into how I first paint, in this case, all the green. I can kind of go a section at a time, and I find that ends up with a better distribution of each color in the end. Also, it means I'm cleaning out my airbrush pretty frequently, maybe every half hour or 20 minutes or so in this process, which is another good practice towards making sure I'm not going to have paint building up on the nozzle or the needle, which could end up giving me a bad spray pattern and other undesirable effects. My last piece of advice here is don't be afraid to turn the model upside down when you're painting it. You notice that as a right-handed person, when I'm spraying, I'm usually coming in at an angle, and that means that the right edge of my spray pattern is actually tighter. Therefore, when I'm spraying the opposite edge of that camouflage squiggle, that demarcation line, I can actually flip the model upside down, and then that way I'm spraying it with a tight edge on the outside again. Hopefully this makes sense. If you're left-handed, it'll be the opposite. It's not always applicable, but it can help sometimes maintain that nice tight edge on the outside of your camouflage squiggles. Also, in general, make sure you're always moving the model around, and that way you're getting paint in all the nooks and crannies and crevices of grills and vents around grab handles and all that good stuff. And here's the result of my camouflage on the model. As I've been saying, I think that I achieved a realistic effect here with tight edges and reasonably sized squiggles to match the arm span of someone in scale who was spraying this camouflage pattern. But it always depends on your reference. You may be painting a certain NATO camouflage pattern, for example, that has relatively wide bands and curves. And if that's the case, so be it. You paint the model how you like. I just hope that in this video I armed you with some good techniques and ideas for how to have an easier time painting camouflage in scale. If you enjoyed the video or have any questions or comments, please post a comment below. I always read through them all and appreciate it. And if you like my work, you can support me on Patreon for just $1 a month. That really helps me out making these videos. As always, I will see you guys next time. Until then, stay safe and happy modeling. See ya.